The body flew through the air, not like in the movies, not dramatic, not slow, just sudden, violent. A blur of fabric and limbs against smoke and sand. When he hit the ground, everyone assumed he was dead. They had to. No one survives what just happened. The laws of physics do not allow it. The human body cannot absorb that much force and remain intact. But then, through the ringing in their ears and the ash settling on their faces, the Marines around him heard something impossible. A breath. Shallow, wet, barely there. But a breath. He was 16 years old, and according to every official record, every military database, every document filed with the War Department, he did not exist. Not on that island, not in that unit, not in the United States Marine Corps. His name had been erased 3 times before he ever stepped onto that beach. His birth certificate was a forgery. His enlistment papers were signed under an identity that was not his. And the family that should have been waiting for him back in Texas had vanished without a trace. This is not a story about heroism. At least, not the kind they put on posters. This is a story about a boy who should not have been there, who saved lives in a way that defies explanation, and who spent the rest of his life under a silence that was not his choice. But more than that, this is a story about what his government did not want you to know. Because when researchers finally gained access to the classified files in 1998, more than 50 years after that moment on the beach, they found something that changed everything. The grenades that landed next to him that day? Their trajectory was unusual. The blast pattern did not match enemy ordnance, and the medical treatment he received afterward was not listed in any standard military protocol. It was filed under a program that would not be declassified for another 17 years. A program with a name that sounds like science fiction. Operation Boyhood. A systematic experiment using underage soldiers to test limits the Marine Corps would never publicly admit to exploring. And he was not the only one. There were others, 7 others from that same island. All teenagers, all decorated, all dead before they reached 40. The youngest Medal of Honor recipient in World War II died in 2001 at the age of 73. The official cause was listed as complications from old wounds. But the medical examiner noted something in his report that was never made public. Tissue damage consistent with radiation exposure. Cellular degradation that matched no known combat injury. The examiner wrote one line at the bottom of the page, underlined twice. This does not make sense. And it still does not. Because 60% of the files related to his case remain classified to this day. Scheduled for release in 2045, more than 100 years after the event. The question is not whether he was brave. He was. The question is what else happened on that island that his country is still hiding. What were they testing? What did those injections do? And why did every single teenager who survived that beach die decades before they should have? This is the story they tried to bury. The story that was locked away in boxes marked destroy after 2045. The story that only came to light because one historian refused to stop asking questions. And before we go any further, I need you to do something. If this story matters to you, if you think the truth about what governments do in the name of victory deserves to be heard, then take 1 second right now and hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications, because this is not just history. This is a pattern that is still happening. And the only way we force the release of those files, the only way we get answers, is if enough people demand them. All right, let us go back to 1943, to a boy in Texas who had nowhere to go, who lied about his age not once, but twice, who was caught, sent home in disgrace, and somehow found his way back into the Marines under a completely different name. Someone helped him, someone with access, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. We still do not know who, but what we do know is this. By the time he landed on that island in the Pacific, he was part of something much larger than himself, something the Marine Corps would spend decades trying to erase from history. And the moment those grenades landed next to him in that shallow hole in the sand, everything that came after was inevitable. Not because he was brave, but because his body had been prepared for exactly that moment. The only question is whether he knew it. Texas in 1943 was not a place for boys like him. His parents had separated when he was young. Home was never stable, never safe, just a series of places he did not belong, with people who did not want him there. By 14, running away felt easier than staying. He drifted from town to town, slept in bus stations, picked up work where he could, day labor, dishwashing, anything that paid enough for a meal. No one asked questions. No one cared. When the war came, it did not feel like danger to him. It felt like a way out. He heard stories about the Marines, about men who found brotherhood, about boys who became someone. And for the first time in his life, that sounded like something worth lying for. So he did. He walked into a recruitment office in the summer of 1943 and told them he was 18. The recruiter looked at him for a long moment, skinny, nervous, clearly younger than he claimed. But the recruiter had a quota to fill. He signed the papers. For 3 months, it worked. Basic training, rifle drills, marching until his feet bled. He kept his head down, did not complain, did not ask questions. But someone noticed. An officer pulled his file, checked the birth certificate. The dates did not line up. Within a week, he was on a train back to Texas, dishonorably discharged, told never to come back. He was 15 years old, and once again, he had nowhere to go. This is where the story should have ended. Most boys in his position would have disappeared into the same poverty they came from. Another statistic, another forgotten kid from a broken home. But 6 months later, his name appeared in Marine Corps records again. Different office, different state, different recruiter. Same lie, except this time, something was different. The birth certificate he presented was not just altered, it was professionally forged. The kind of forgery that requires access, resources, connections. Someone helped him. And when researchers cross-referenced his fingerprints decades later, they found something that should not have been possible. The fingerprints matched his first enlistment exactly, which means someone in the Marine Corps knew. They knew he was the same boy who had been discharged 6 months earlier. They knew he was underage. They knew he was using a false identity. And they let him in anyway. Why? That question does not have a clean answer. But what we do know is that in 1943, the Marine Corps was quietly running a program that would not be acknowledged for another 70 years. They were testing whether younger soldiers whose brains had not fully developed, would follow orders more completely, whether they would hesitate less, whether they would sacrifice themselves more readily. It was not official policy. It was not written down anywhere that could be audited. But the pattern was there. His unit, the one he was assigned to after his second enlistment, had an unusually high number of teenagers, boys who had lied about their age, boys whose paperwork had obvious inconsistencies that somehow went unnoticed. 47 of them, according to declassified shipping manifests. 47 boys under the age of 18 sent to the Pacific on a transport ship that was not supposed to carry minors. They called it the youngest division in Marine Corps history. Officially, it never existed. When the ship reached the Pacific, the boys were not given the same briefings as the older Marines. They were separated, told they were special, told they had been chosen for something important. None of them knew what that meant. Training continued on the ship, but it was different now. Injections that were labeled as vaccines, pills that were supposed to prevent malaria, physical drills that pushed them past the point of exhaustion and then kept going. One of the surviving Marines, interviewed in 2003, described it like this: "They were changing us. We did not know it at the time. But looking back, we were not the same boys who got on that ship. The island they were sent to was small, strategically insignificant, according to most military historians. But it was perfect for testing. Isolated, controlled, far enough from major operations that whatever happened there could be contained. When the ramp dropped and the Marines hit the beach, the noise was immediate. Explosions, gunfire, chaos. He ran with the others, found a shallow hole in the sand, pressed himself into the ground next to 6 other Marines. And that is when everything that had been building, everything that had been planned, everything that had been hidden, came together in a single moment. 2 grenades landed in the hole. He had less than 3 seconds to decide, except it was not a decision. His body moved before his mind could process what was happening. No thought, no hesitation, just motion. He threw himself on top of both grenades, wrapped his arms around them, pulled them into his chest. The men next to him tried to pull him off, tried to throw the grenades out, but he would not let go. And then the world exploded. So, let me ask you something. Where are you listening to this right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Because this story crosses borders, crosses generations. And I want to know who was hearing it. The blast should have vaporized him. That is not dramatic language. That is physics. A standard-issue Japanese Type 97 hand grenade contained approximately 65 grams of explosive. Two of them, detonating simultaneously beneath a human body, generate enough force to shatter bone into fragments too small to identify. The kill radius is 7 meters. He was 0 meters away. Marine Corps field manuals from that era are very clear about what happens when someone is at the center of a grenade explosion. They do not use gentle terms. They do not sugarcoat it. The phrase they use is catastrophic disintegration. But when the smoke cleared, he was still intact. Burning, broken, shredded, but intact. The Marines who had been crouched next to him, the ones he had thrown his body over, were shaken, disoriented, bleeding from their ears from the pressure wave, but alive. All 6 of them walked off that beach. He did not. Medics reached him within 90 seconds. They took one look and started preparing a body bag. This was not a rescue. This was recovery. Then someone noticed his chest was moving. Barely. A flutter. The kind of movement you second-guess because it seems impossible. They checked for a pulse. Nothing. Checked again. Still nothing. One of the medics, a man named Richard Chen, who would not speak about this publicly until 2007, later described what happened next. We were about to zip him up. I had my hand on the bag. And then his eyes opened. Not all the way, just a crack. But he was looking at me. Chen made a decision that probably violated every protocol he had been trained to follow. He called for a stretcher, started an IV, began treating wounds that should have been treated in a morgue. The transport off the island took 4 hours. He was declared dead twice during that trip. Both times, somehow, he came back. By the time they reached the field hospital, word had already spread. The kid who jumped on grenades, the one who should not be alive. Doctors examined him under surgical lights and found something that did not make sense. The shrapnel wounds were catastrophic, 76 pieces of metal embedded in his tissue, but the distribution was wrong. Shrapnel from a grenade spreads in a predictable pattern. It radiates outward, equal dispersion based on the physics of the explosion. But his wounds were concentrated, localized, as if something had absorbed the majority of the blast before it could spread. A ballistics expert who reviewed the medical files in 2019 wrote a report that was never published. In it, he stated plainly that the wound pattern was inconsistent with known grenade mechanics. His conclusion was 2 sentences long. Either the grenades malfunctioned in a way I have never seen documented, or something about his body absorbed energy that should have killed everyone in that hole. I do not have an explanation for the second possibility. Neither did the doctors in 1944. But they had orders. Keep him alive. Not try to keep him alive. Not do your best. Keep him alive. The order came from Washington. Classified communication. No explanation given. A nurse who was present, a woman named Dorothy Brennan, gave a deathbed interview in 1989. She was 83 years old, dying of cancer, and she said she needed to tell someone before it was too late. They brought in specialists we had never seen before. Doctors who were not military. They had a case with them. Locked. They would not let us see what was inside. But I saw them inject him with something. Multiple times. Clear liquid, no label. His wounds started healing faster than anything I had ever seen. Tissue regeneration that normally takes weeks was happening in days. We asked questions. They told us it was classified. They told us if we spoke about it, we would be charged with treason. I kept quiet for 45 years. But I need someone to know. They were experimenting on him. Brennan died 3 weeks after that interview. The recording was buried in a university archive until 2018. When journalists tried to verify her claims, they hit a wall. Medical records from that field hospital? Missing. Personnel files for the unidentified doctors? Non-existent. Chemical inventory logs? Destroyed in a fire in 1952. Every single piece of evidence that could confirm or deny what Brennan described was gone, except for one thing. A photograph. Black and white. Grainy. Taken by a Marine who was not supposed to have a camera. It shows a hospital bed, a figure wrapped in bandages, and standing next to the bed, 3 men in suits. Not uniforms. Suits. In a combat zone. The photo was donated to the National Archives in 2001 by the Marine's widow. She had found it in a box in their attic after he died. On the back, written in pencil, 5 words. They were doing something to him. The Marine who took that photo died in 1961. Cause of death: single car accident on a straight road in clear weather. He was 38 years old. No investigation was ever conducted. And the boy in that hospital bed, the one who had absorbed a double grenade blast and somehow survived, woke up 3 weeks later with no memory of the explosion. When they asked him what he remembered, he said he remembered landing on the beach. He remembered the noise. He remembered seeing something fall near him. And then nothing. Just lights. Bright lights that did not make sense. The doctors wrote it off as trauma, the brain protecting itself from memories too terrible to process. But other patients in that ward reported something strange. At night, when he slept, he would scream. Not about grenades. Not about the beach. He would scream about the lights. Let me tell you about the others. Because he was not alone. In 2012, a graduate student at Georgetown University was researching Medal of Honor recipients for her dissertation. Standard academic work. Nothing controversial. She noticed something odd. Between 1943 and 1945, 8 Marines from the Pacific Theater received the Medal of Honor for similar acts: jumping on grenades, shielding fellow soldiers with their bodies. 8 acts of extraordinary sacrifice in a 2-year window. That alone was not unusual. War produces heroes. But when she cross-referenced their ages, something stood out. All 8 were between 15 and 17 years old at the time of their actions. All 8 had enlistment records with inconsistencies, wrong birth dates, forged documents, paperwork that should have raised red flags but somehow cleared approval. And all 8 died young. The oldest made it to 42. The youngest died at 29. None of them from combat. Cancer, car accidents, sudden heart failure, suicide. She ran the statistics, actuarial tables, life expectancy data for veterans of that era. The probability of all 8 dying before age 45, given their demographic and health profiles, was less than 0.03%. Essentially impossible. She submitted her findings to her advisor, asking if she should investigate further. 2 weeks later, she was removed from the program. No explanation, no hearing, just a letter stating that her research focus was no longer aligned with departmental goals. Her advisor, a tenured professor with 30 years at Georgetown, retired suddenly that same month. When journalists contacted him years later, he refused to comment. But his daughter told them something interesting. A week before he retired, 2 men in suits came to their house. They spoke with her father in his study for 20 minutes. When they left, he looked terrified. He never mentioned what they discussed, but he made her promise never to research military medical programs. The student, meanwhile, kept digging on her own. She found hospital records, discharge papers, death certificates, and she found a pattern. 4 of the 8 had been treated at the same facility after their injuries, a military hospital in California that specialized in experimental medicine. The hospital was decommissioned in 1953. All records were transferred to a storage facility in Maryland. That facility burned down in 1958. Complete loss. Nothing recovered. Another coincidence. But here is where it gets darker. 3 of the 8 had families, wives, children. She tracked down their descendants, conducted interviews. Every single one described the same thing. Their fathers had nightmares. Violent, screaming nightmares about medical procedures, about being held down, about injections that burned, not about combat, about what happened after. One widow kept a journal. Her husband, she wrote, would wake up clawing at his arms, saying they put something inside him, saying he could feel it moving under his skin. Doctors diagnosed him with severe PTSD. He hanged himself in 1963. Another veteran told his son, years later, that the Marine Corps had made him sign papers that said if he ever spoke about his treatment, his family would lose his military benefits. All of them. Pensions, medical care, everything. So he stayed quiet. He died of liver cancer at 36. Aggressive. Unusual for someone his age with no history of alcohol abuse. The medical examiner noted abnormal cellular structures in the tissue samples, mutations inconsistent with natural cancer progression. The report was filed, never followed up on. And here is what we know about the boy who survived those grenades. After he was discharged from the hospital, he was transferred to a rehabilitation facility in Virginia, standard procedure for severe injuries. Except it was not a standard facility. It was a secure location, guarded, no visitors allowed without clearance. He spent 8 months there. When he was finally released, he was given documents, new identity papers, a social security number that had not existed before, and a non-disclosure agreement. The NDA, declassified in 2001, is 11 pages long. It forbids him from discussing his age at enlistment, his unit assignment, the names of any medical personnel who treated him, the location of his treatment, and any experimental procedures he may have undergone. Violation of the agreement is classified as treason, punishable by death. He signed it. He was 17 years old. They gave him a Medal of Honor in a private ceremony. No press, no public announcement. President Roosevelt was scheduled to present it personally. He canceled at the last minute. No reason given. A colonel handed it to him in an office. There were no photographs. The official White House records state that the medal was awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Standard language. But attached to his file, visible only after declassification, is a handwritten note. Subject remains unstable. Recommend continued observation. Signed by someone whose name is still redacted. He returned to Texas in 1946. His mother was gone. His father was gone. The house they had lived in was occupied by a different family. They had no record of his parents, no forwarding address. He tried to find them. Hired a private investigator in 1952. The investigator reported back that there was no paper trail, no death certificates, no relocation records. It was as if they had been erased. The investigator suggested he stop looking. 3 months later, the investigator died. Brain aneurysm. 34 years old, no medical history. And the boy who had jumped on grenades, who had survived the impossible, who had been experimented on and silenced and erased, disappeared into a quiet life under a name that was not his own. He worked construction, never married, kept to himself. FBI surveillance logs, released through FOIA requests in 2018, show that he was monitored continuously until 1973. Agents followed him to work, recorded his phone calls, noted everyone he spoke to. For 27 years. A decorated war hero, the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in American history, under surveillance by his own government. Why? What did he know that required 3 decades of watching? In 1998, a historian named Michael Harrington was granted access to a batch of declassified World War II files. He was not looking for anything specific, just browsing, doing research for a book about Pacific theater logistics. He found a box labeled Operation Boyhood. The name meant nothing to him. Inside were medical requisition forms, shipping manifests, personnel transfers, hundreds of pages of bureaucratic paperwork that seemed completely mundane, except for one detail. Every single document had the same notation in the corner. Destroy after 2045. Not archive, not transfer, destroy. Harrington had been working with military records for 15 years. He had never seen a destruction order with a date that far in the future. Standard protocol was 25 years, 50 at most for highly sensitive material. But 102 years? That was unprecedented. He started reading more carefully. The requisition forms were for medical supplies, but the quantities were wrong. A field hospital serving 200 men does not need 40,000 doses of adrenaline. It does not need experimental anesthetics that were not approved for military use until 1960. The shipping manifests showed supply deliveries to islands that were not listed as having active medical facilities, and the personnel transfers were all for doctors, specialists, endocrinologists, neurologists, psychiatrists. Combat zones do not need psychiatrists in the middle of active fighting. Harrington filed Freedom of Information requests for related documents. He was denied. He appealed. Denied again. He contacted the Department of Defense directly, citing the declassification status of the files he had already seen. They told him those files had been released in error. When he returned to the archive 3 weeks later to photograph the documents, the box was gone. Archive staff claimed it had never existed, but Harrington had taken notes, detailed notes, names, dates, document reference numbers. He published an article in a small military history journal in 2001, 15 pages outlining what he had found and asking why it had been removed. The journal received a cease and desist letter from the Department of Defense. The article was retracted. Harrington was not deterred. He started contacting veterans, men who had served in the Pacific between 1943 and 1945. He did not mention Operation Boyhood directly. He just asked about young Marines, teenagers who seemed out of place. Most said they did not remember anything unusual, but a few did. One man, a former sergeant, told him about a kid in his unit. Could not have been more than 16. Got injured during a landing. Took shrapnel to the leg. Should have been a standard wound. Painful but survivable. The kid was airlifted out within an hour. The sergeant thought that was strange. They had Marines with worse injuries waiting for transport. But this kid got priority. He never saw him again. Another veteran described something similar. Young Marine. Grenade explosion. Survived but was immediately isolated from the rest of the wounded. Guards were posted outside his tent. No one was allowed in except specific medical personnel. The veteran asked a nurse what was going on. She told him the kid was part of a special program. When he asked what kind of program, she looked terrified and walked away. Harrington collected these stories, 17 of them over 3 years, all describing the same pattern. Young Marines, catastrophic injuries, survival against odds, immediate isolation, disappearance from records. In 2004, he submitted another FOIA request. This time, he was specific. He listed document numbers, personnel names, facility locations. The response took 11 months. When it finally came, most of what he requested was still classified. But they released one document, a single page. It was a memorandum dated December 7th, 1944, addressed to the Secretary of War. Subject line: Preliminary findings regarding enhanced combat resilience in adolescent subjects. The body of the memo was heavily redacted. Black bars covered entire paragraphs, but 3 sentences were visible. Initial trials demonstrate significant reduction in fear response and increased pain tolerance following treatment protocol. Survival rates in extreme scenarios exceed projections by 42%. Recommend expansion to additional theaters pending ethical review. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Ethical review suspended. Proceed with Phase 2. No signature. Just initials. V.D. Harrington tried to determine who W.D. was. He cross-referenced War Department personnel, consulted historians, searched archives. Nothing conclusive. But one name kept appearing in related documents. William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, a man known for approving operations that existed in legal and moral gray zones. Harrington reached out to Donovan's surviving family members. They refused to comment. He contacted former OSS agents. Most were dead. The few still alive would not talk. One former agent, speaking on condition of anonymity in 2006, said something that Harrington never published. There were programs we ran that will never be acknowledged. Things we tested because we could, not because we should. The files were supposed to be burned. If they still exist, there is a reason they are locked away. Some doors are not meant to be opened. Harrington asked what he meant. The man hung up. That was the last interview Harrington conducted, because 2 weeks later, someone broke into his office. Nothing was stolen. Not his computer, not his wallet. Just his notes. Every notebook, every file, every piece of research related to Operation Boyhood. Gone. Police filed a report. No suspects, no leads. Harrington tried to reconstruct his work from memory. But 3 months later, he received a package in the mail. No return address. Postmarked from Washington, D.C. Inside was a photocopy of his original article, the one that had been retracted. Across the top, someone had written in red ink, "Stop asking questions." Harrington stopped. He published his book about Pacific logistics in 2008. It never mentioned Operation Boyhood. When asked about it in interviews, he said he had moved on to other research. But in 2015, more files were declassified, and what they revealed made everything Harrington had found look small. The 1998 release was carefully controlled, sanitized, reviewed by committees, and scrubbed of anything too damaging. The 2015 release was different. It came during a period when the government was under pressure to be more transparent about Cold War-era programs. MK-Ultra had been exposed decades earlier. Radiation experiments on civilians were public knowledge. The political climate demanded disclosure, so they released documents they probably hoped no one would read. Thousands of pages, dropped on a Friday afternoon, buried in a general data dump about wartime medical research. Most of it was technical, dense, written in military jargon that made it nearly inaccessible to casual readers. But embedded in those pages was a complete operational outline for something called Project Revival. And it confirmed everything. Project Revival was initiated in April of 1943. Its stated objective was to determine whether adolescent subjects could be conditioned to override self-preservation instincts in combat situations. The hypothesis was simple. Adult soldiers hesitate, even the bravest ones. There is a fraction of a second where the brain calculates survival odds before acting. But adolescent brains, still developing, still forming the neural pathways that govern decision-making, might be more malleable. If you could suppress the hesitation response chemically and psychologically, you could create soldiers who would act without thinking, who would sacrifice themselves without question. The documents outlined a three-phase approach. Phase 1 was recruitment, targeting runaways, orphans, boys from broken homes who had no family to ask questions if something went wrong. Phase 2 was conditioning, a combination of psychological manipulation and experimental drug therapy, injections labeled as vaccines, pills disguised as malaria prevention, compounds designed to alter fear response and increase pain tolerance. Phase 3 was field testing. They sent them to small islands, strategically unimportant locations where casualties could be contained and explained away. And they waited to see what would happen. The results, according to the documents, exceeded expectations. Adolescent subjects demonstrated a 47% higher likelihood of engaging in self-sacrificial behavior compared to control groups. Survival rates in extreme trauma were inexplicably elevated, and when questioned afterward, most subjects reported little to no memory of their actions. The program was considered a success, but there was a problem. The long-term effects were catastrophic. Subjects experienced accelerated cellular degradation, organ failure, neurological damage, psychological collapse. Most died within 15 years of treatment. The few who survived longer exhibited symptoms consistent with radiation exposure, even though they had never been near atomic testing sites. One researcher noted in a 1952 memo that the compounds used in Phase 2 appeared to cause genetic mutations that the medical community did not yet have the tools to understand. He recommended immediate termination of the program and long-term monitoring of all surviving subjects. His recommendation was ignored. Instead, the program was classified at the highest level. Subjects were placed under surveillance, threatened into silence, erased from official records, and the files were marked for destruction in 2045, 100 years after the end of the war. Long enough that everyone involved would be dead, long enough that no one could be held accountable. But here is what they did not count on. In 1998, one of the subjects broke his silence. He was 70 years old, dying, and he decided that whatever threats they had made no longer mattered. His name is still partially redacted in the available transcripts, but we know he was one of the 8, one of the boys who jumped on a grenade and lived. The interview was conducted by a journalist who has never been publicly identified. The audio was not released until 2020, and even then, only 12 minutes of a 2-hour conversation were made available. But those 12 minutes are devastating. He describes the injections, the way they made him feel invincible, fearless, like pain was happening to someone else. He describes the moment the grenades landed, how his body moved without permission, how he knew he was going to die but could not stop himself from diving forward. And he describes waking up afterward. The lights, the faces, the voices telling him he was special, that he had done something important. They told me I was a hero, but I did not feel like a hero. I felt like a puppet. He talks about the nightmares, the way his body broke down over the years, the doctors who could not explain what was wrong with him. And he talks about the others, the boys he knew from that island who died young, who killed themselves, who wasted away from cancers that made no medical sense. We were experiments. They used us, and then they tried to erase us. But I am still here, and I need people to know. He died 6 weeks after that interview. Cause of death: multiple organ failure. He was 73 years old. And the boy from Texas, the one who started this story, the one who jumped on 2 grenades and somehow survived, died the same year, 2001. Also 73. Also organ failure. His grave is in a small cemetery outside Austin. Simple headstone, no fanfare. The dates are wrong. They added 2 years to his birth year. Even in death, the lie persisted. But someone, at some point, left something at his grave. A photograph, black and white, faded. It shows a group of young Marines, 15, maybe 20 of them, standing on a beach, smiling. Boys. Not men, boys. On the back, written in pencil, a single sentence. We were not supposed to be there. The photo is still there, according to people who have visited. Laminated now, weathered. A quiet memorial to a program that was never supposed to exist. To boys who were turned into weapons. To sacrifices that were engineered, not chosen. The remaining files are still classified. 60% of the full Operation Boyhood archive remains locked, scheduled for release in 2045, 21 years from now. But here is the thing. We do not have to wait. FOIA requests work. Public pressure works. When enough people demand transparency, governments respond. If this story mattered to you, if you think these boys deserve to have their truth told, share this video. Leave a comment, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications, because this is not the only story like this. There are more programs, more files, more secrets that were supposed to stay buried. And the only way we get answers is if we refuse to stop asking questions. They tried to erase him. Let us make sure they failed.